presentation to the commission. It's been work that I've been tracking really over the year. That at the beginning they identified that it would be useful to be collecting data and having a sense of it with the ear to the ground, the impacts that this pandemic was having on young families in particular. I think his data has been a source of interest and of and of intelligence, quite frankly, for the policy conversations. You can see the work has been recently featured in Forbes, at the Riser Network, the New York Times, and the Urban Institute. We're so thankful to have him here and to learn from him and to think about how it informs our work. So as we think about our work, really to provide the context for Alameda County, what we know is that 1 in 10 children under the age of 5 live below the federal poverty line. That we know our food bank, to earlier comments around kind of hunger and need for access to food, that our community members are experiencing food insecurity, and that has demonstrated itself through data with a reported of 1.2 million pounds of food being distributed monthly. I was told that number is double what was being distributed pre-pandemic. In national surveys, they've indicated that 1 in 4 children are experiencing hunger. And we also know that that these hardships are borne disproportionately, particularly among communities of color. So in Alameda County, Black households take home is roughly 1/3 income of white households after rent. And then within the context of the provider community, as Anna indicated earlier, that we're experiencing about an estimated $18 million loss of revenue to childcare businesses, that they're operating at about a 60% capacity within Alameda County at this time. And then in terms of, because we've had a focus on concrete needs and recognizing that really we're in a triple pandemic as it relates to health, as it relates to economics, and as it relates to structural racism, we've also partnered with other entities to pull up the data to help to inform the policy conversation. And so we worked with Help a Mother Out, who was awarded state funds a couple of years ago to do the diaper distribution. So we've been doing that with them and with the community, and invested in an evaluation so that we could then lift up the data to inform statewide policy work. So the findings are striking in terms of those parents that were surveyed related to the diaper work, that they're reporting after receiving the diaper support that 97% are healthier, that they have less income stress, and that they're happier caregiver to their children. And I think that this speaks to the connection between socioeconomic realities and those stresses, and when we think about child development and family and community well-being. We've also been doing the essential supply work with supplybank.org, and so the partnership with both of these entities has been critical, I think, and offered support to family and community broadly. Next slide. And then to highlight, we just went over our budget, but just to bring it up, and I know that the commission has provided leadership as it relates to the allocation of these funds, but as an agency, we implemented close to $11 million in a community resilience fund that was really a layered approach that included funding to school districts, that was for direct supplies, that was in partnership with family serving shelters, and very, very impactful, I think, to the community at large. And then in partnership with the larger systems who have also moved to operate and address. So these pictures are actually from the Purifier giveaway that was done in March. And then as the pandemic continues, and as it was said earlier, we as a community look to climb out, hopefully from under. I will be working closely with staff and with commissioners to identify if there's any additional resources or needs that we can provide to support our community and our provider network. So with that, Dr. Fisher, with those data points and with that context in terms of the needs that we have, in our county. Dr. Fisher is going to share with us the national work that he has done. And then I hope that we end with some reflection on what the data indicates when we think about policy and program investments. And then want to appreciate Commissioner Moreno, who has offered to moderate the Q&A. So Dr. Fisher.
Hi, thank you all for joining today to listen to this presentation. And especially thank you to Kristen for the invitation and the opportunity to come and speak with you. Can everybody see my screen? I can no longer see you now that I've put the slide sharing on.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay, great. Thanks so much. So as Kristen mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about today is a survey that we launched actually a year ago, almost to the day, when the pandemic was really just taking hold in this country. And the reason that we launched the survey at the time was that we knew that this country was really facing circumstances that none of us in our lifetimes had lived through. And because our work at my center has historically focused on how early life experiences shape the developing brain and health and well-being across the lifespan, we knew that early childhood was a particularly vulnerable time for children to be living through an experience like the pandemic. We also knew that there wasn't a lot of good data to inform policy decisions at that time. And we had a very clear sense that things were changing in a dynamic way, sort of frequently enough, that we needed a survey that could really capture family voice and amplify it but in ways that were scientifically rigorous in order to inform decisions that would be made moving forward. So we have been now at this for a year, and this is really the story of the survey. I want to start just by acknowledging that there are a number of partnerships, including funders, but also a number of organizations that we've worked with in the context of the work that we've been doing. And now let me just share some of the details. So first of all, the way that our survey works is that it goes out every other week. Actually, when we started in last April, it was happening every week. Every time the survey goes out, we recruit just over 1,000 households from around the country. So we have participants in all 50 states. The survey is designed to be a national survey, not only in terms of geography, but also in terms of race and ethnicity, and in terms of income. It takes about 15 minutes for people to complete. They need to have a computer or smartphone with cell service, but they don't need to have broadband access to be able to complete the survey. And it's available in English or Spanish. One of the most interesting areas that the survey has really focused on, and I think that this was really not something that we necessarily intended at the beginning, but we thought we'd throw in some open-ended questions just to let people tell us their thoughts, in addition to having kind of quantitative data that we were collecting. And families have clearly been very eager to share their experiences. We actually are now over 130,000 responses to our open-ended questions, in addition to the quantitative data. And they really help to tell the story of what's going on with households during the pandemic. So the focus of the survey has been really on a variety of specific domains that we ask about every time the survey goes out. First, we ask about parent emotional well-being, specifically in 4 areas: stress, depression, anxiety, and loneliness. We also ask about child emotional well-being, in particular in terms of children being fussy and upset or defiant, as well as fearful or anxious. We've been gathering a tremendous amount of data that relates to the conversation I think I came in on for this meeting around the economic circumstances of families. And in particular, we learned very quickly that just asking about income was insufficient, and that we really needed to do a deeper dive into families' abilities to pay for basic needs like food and housing and utilities. We've asked a number of questions about childcare. And then we've also gotten a considerable amount of information about participation in healthcare and access to healthcare during the pandemic. So Let me just say that one of the primary findings, I'm going to share several, but one of the primary findings has to do with the pervasiveness of difficulty paying for basic needs during the pandemic. So this slide shows what you can see that I've shown here is just the proportion of households in our survey that reported that there was at least one area, food, housing, utilities, childcare, healthcare, where they were not able to make ends meet, where they were not able to pay for those basic needs. And what you can see is that from the time that we started in April through around September, that those rates were going up consistently. And that time intersects with when some of the first pandemic relief went away and the first stimulus payments had already been had been dispensed, and where we saw at the end of July, the end of the CARES Act. And so you can see that by the end of July into August and September, that more than 1 in 3 households in our survey of all households with young children aged 5 and under were experiencing at least one area where they couldn't pay for basic needs. Since the end of the summer and moving into the fall, really the story is one of stabilization. So it's still remained about a third all the way through November, December. A third of all families were reporting at least one material hardship. There is a little bit of bright news that's come about in our last 4 surveys. What we found is actually a drop in the proportion of families that are reporting at least one material hardship. We are waiting to see if that trend continues, if it stabilizes where it is, but it certainly suggests that at least some things that may be happening, including some of the American Recovery Plan money starting to be dispensed and employment kind of returning, that maybe rates are down. Even though the trend looks positive, I also want to be very clear, it's still 1 in 4 households with a young child that are reporting difficulty paying for basic needs. Why is economic hardship a particular concern for us? Well, it's tied directly to how well parents and their children are doing. So here you can see a very clear relationship between the number of areas in which people are struggling to make ends meet and the levels of emotional distress that we're seeing. And that's true for the graph on the left. You can see it's true for parents, and it's also true for what parents are reporting about their children. So difficulty not being able to pay for basic needs really is clearly increasing the levels of difficulty and distress among parents and children. And it's not just an association that we're seeing. What we're seeing in a lot of our data is that it actually is a sequence that unfolds across time. So when we follow families longitudinally across multiple weeks, we find that those who are reporting these kinds of economic hardships in a given week are more likely in follow-up to report that they're feeling increased levels of distress. And then when we look at those families where the parents are reporting higher levels of distress, we see subsequently that there are increased levels of distress in their children. This is concern for us because in our research, and there's plenty of other research about this, there's this concept of toxic stress. And toxic stress isn't just having a bad day, it's not having some difficulties in your life. Lots of kinds of stress are either positive, they actually help kind of get you more motivated to do things, or they're at least tolerable. But in fact, what you see is chronic stress, so stress that's ongoing and that continuously activates these biological stress response systems. When that's going on with young kids, in the absence of parents' ability to buffer children from these kinds of responses that their bodies are having by helping to soothe and calm them, that's when we begin to see these alterations in brain and in other areas of biological functioning like immune and inflammatory functioning that can create long-term health risks across the lifespan. And I want to be clear, in no way are we saying that this is the stuff that's going on right now is because parents just simply don't care about their kids or are more worried about themselves or anything like that. But what we are saying is that circumstances that make it difficult for parents to be as nurturing as they can be because they're distressed about things like, will I have food on the table? Will I be out on the street? are things that can be bad for kids in the long run because of this kind of toxic stress process. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that at the end. So that just the pervasiveness of material hardship and its ties to parent and child well-being is one of the major findings. The second that I think has already been alluded to is that we're seeing in our data that structural inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic based on race and ethnicity have just gotten wider in the context of the pandemic. So these are the material hardship rates, or the proportion of families reporting at least one material hardship across the same span of time from last April until now. And what you can see on the far right is white households, and you can see that the levels of material hardship in white households have been lower, about 1 in 4, whereas in Black and Latinx households, the rates have been as high as 60%, and they've maintained a much higher level in the approximately 40 to 50%. So 1 in 2 households, Black and Latinx households in our national sample are reporting that there's at least one area where they can't make ends meet, and that's been pretty consistent across time. We're interested in what we're seeing here in terms of a decrease recently, especially for Black households in the proportion experiencing material hardship, and that's something that we want to watch as time goes by. But the other evidence, and I think this is really a dramatic representation, I need to walk you through this slide, of structural inequalities is where, at what income levels are different racial and ethnic groups experiencing material hardship. And so what you can see is that if you look at across this is the lowest income households, those who are 200% or more below the federal poverty line. You can see that for all 3 groups, Black, Latinx, and white households, that the rates of material hardship have been high. But as you go into 200 to 40% of the FPL, and even more above 400%, what you can see is that the white households have less proportion of those households reporting material hardship and much more stability. By the time you get to above 400%, there's virtually no material hardship. When we look at Black households in this middle income range, you can see that the rates have continued to be high and have fluctuated a lot, but can be double or more what we're seeing in white households. Same is true in Latinx households in this middle income group. And even among those, and this is important to acknowledge, those who reported, these are income levels that are pre-pandemic income levels. So these are Black households that were above 400% federal poverty line before the pandemic. And these are Latinx households who are the same. And you can see that in both of these groups, there are many who've experienced difficulty making ends meet. The explanation for this lies in some very well documented demographic differences that we know of in different groups. So in Black and Latinx households, relative to white households, there's a well-documented wealth gap, less accumulated wealth, more difficulty obtaining credit and loans when needed. There's also a tendency to be supporting extended family members, including those outside of the home who are not doing as well in terms of income. And then thirdly, during the pandemic, the jobs that were higher paying jobs that Black and Latinx households members have been less stable and less secure. And so there's been a lot of job loss of higher paying jobs, or reduction in jobs, or people taking lower paying jobs because those jobs have gone away. So clear examples of structural inequalities with respect to employment and income. We also see this, as I mentioned, in the qualitative data that we've obtained. So we have asked people in these open-ended questions, one of the things we asked was, well, what are the biggest challenges that you're facing during the pandemic? Just tell us what's going on. And we get, again, tens of thousands of responses to these questions. We then can use this lexical analysis approach called structural topic modeling to identify thematic content, themes that are coming out the most in people's responses. When we separate our data by Black versus white households, here's what comes out. So white households in our sample, really the challenges that they're facing are mostly related to the social deprivation and social distancing that's occurred because of the pandemic. Missing family members, isolation, sleep problems, anxiety, things like that. When we look at what are the concerns that are raised the most by Black households, you see that basic needs is by far the biggest one, but that other ones like debt and house, car problems, paying expenses, all of these material hardship issues are weighing heavily on Black households. And it really, this tells the story from our perspective of two different pandemics that have been experienced in very different ways, depending on who you're talking about and what kinds of issues people are facing. Okay, another big issue, and I'll be moving quickly now to sort of what, not only what we're finding, but then also kind of what we should be thinking about moving forward. But we have found that healthcare, just family healthcare for families with young children has been affected. So 83%, 84% of our households report that they have delayed getting healthcare for some health problem for themselves or one of their family members. Over 40% of our households have missed at least one well baby or well child visits. And that number is actually even higher. Half of households with a special needs child have reported missing a preventative healthcare visit. That's a great concern to us, especially with special needs households, because of the amount of developmental monitoring and referral to services that can happen in healthcare for kids with special needs. And then clearly a lot of vaccinations being missed. One trend I think that at least is information that's useful is that the healthcare that's being missed, especially well child visits, is happening more for older kids. So very young babies are still, it looks like, getting in to see the doctor pretty frequently. But as kids get older, there's been more and more missed visits. Childcare. So childcare is another huge area of intersection between kind of family well-being and what this country needs to be able to get back on its feet. This is, I think, not any kind of news to this group that I'm talking to today, but we have been very interested in understanding what's going on with providers as well as households during the pandemic. And so we just about a month ago launched a parallel survey, national survey of providers to try to understand what's going on with them and what their needs are. When we talk about childcare providers, we are using a very broad kind of lens in terms of what we're thinking. So this is really who takes care of your kids when you or somebody else in your immediate household is not doing so. So it could be center-based care, it could be home-based care, it could be formal or informal, it could be people who don't even identify as providers. It could be a grandparent or other relative. So it's anybody, family, friend, and neighbor, or licensed or informal care that is involved in children's lives. The data are much smaller in number at this point, so I want to just qualify the information I'm going to be presenting here. But we see material hardship rates at the same levels as we're seeing in households, if not a little bit higher for providers. So 45% of all of our providers that we've surveyed to date report at least one form of material hardship. We see the same structural inequalities based on race and ethnicity. Again, our numbers are small, so these differences in the proportion experiencing material hardship are not statistically meaningful yet, but as our numbers grow, if the trends remain, they will be. So close to 1 in 3 Black providers say that they're having difficulty with basic needs, about half of Latinx, and then just above 40% of white providers are saying they're having difficulties. We analyzed the open-ended responses to several questions, and I just have done a much more rudimentary type of analysis here that I'm showing you. This is just a word cloud of the most commonly occurring words in the response to this question. What are the biggest challenges and concerns for you as a provider? And you can see that there's a lot of content in here that has to do with keeping kids safe, worried about getting sick, how you deal with staff and things like that. So a lot of safety concerns from the part of providers right now. And I think relevant to this audience, what would you like your elected officials or other policymakers to know about how you and your family are doing? Well, providers say basically they need help paying for things and that they're having a lot of difficulties. And then they have concerns about pandemic and other kinds of things. But I think need help paying is pretty much something that speaks for itself. So what are our recommendations? Well, first I want to say in our conversations that we've had with Kristen and the rest of the first 5 Alamedas team, I think we see a tremendous amount of kind of complementarity and synergy in terms of what we're thinking and the policy agenda that First Five Alameda has laid out for 2021. We're talking about what needs to be done in terms of policy efforts, and especially local policy efforts, because as we know, policy starts at the federal government, but really it gets implemented at state and then county levels and into communities. And so we see really four cornerstones in which, and they're really intersecting cornerstones that we should be focusing on. One is financial stability and relief. That continues to come out for us as the biggest issue. And I want to note one of the things that we're studying right now in our data, which we will have data on very soon, is that money coming in may be somewhat helpful in alleviating material hardship, but we also know that many families have accrued a vast amount of debt around things like not being able to pay their utilities. In fact, utility difficulties is the single thing that's consistently stood out as something that families are having a hard time paying for. It's the area of basic needs that's most commonly not met. And so we expect that even as child tax credit and other funding becomes available, that people are going to still have some difficulty with financial stability, and it'll be a while before they're out from underwater. The other three cornerstones, first of all, systems change really needs to happen in order to have more coordinated and integrated child and family services. I think programs like Help a Mother Out, diaper banks can be essential because they really do bring together the sort of variety of different social, emotional, economic, and material needs under a single kind of focal area like providing diapers. Also, we know that everyone, that parents, that children, that providers are all going to need emotional support from formal sources like from the provider world, from home visitation and other kinds of programs, and informal, more support for family and friends. We found that one of the biggest interrupters of the chain reaction of hardship that we've observed is the extent to which people have emotional support in their lives. And then time is the fourth cornerstone. People need time so that when they're sick, they can have paid sick leave and they can focus on their health and well-being, paid vacation time, which everybody is entitled to and needs in order to recreate and re-energize. And also maternity and paternity leave are things. These are longstanding issues that we really need to be able to continue to focus on. We see Measure C from where we sit as having a huge amount of transformative opportunity. I know that the funding for that is still somewhat in question as it makes its way through some of the litigation, but we think it's a tremendous opportunity to examine how you might shore up the provider system and childcare for families in your community. And we think that there's a lot of potential as not only in terms of Measure C, but in terms of all of the great work that's going on in Alameda County to use tools like our rapid survey, where we're getting data every 2 weeks, to continue to understand the needs that households have and providers have, and then to examine whether those needs seem to be being impacted by programs and policies that are put in place. So we're very eager to continue discussions about potential partnerships that we might undertake. We have a lot of other local partnerships involving the survey that we're just starting to talk about getting going in communities like Alameda County, where there is really innovative work happening. So I'll stop my share there and turn things back over for Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fisher, for that presentation. It was both confirming and convicting of, kind of where families are. I am going to turn it over to Commissioner Moreno right now, and she's going to moderate the next part of our time together.
Great, thank you, Chair Hirschfeld, and thank you, Dr. Fisher. That was indeed an amazing presentation. In my words, it was illuminating and sobering as well, I think, in the ways that many of us have been experiencing. And I would say, in the top of your comments, you really talked about capturing family voice. And I just want to appreciate and acknowledge that being such an important piece of what I saw in the data, the fact that you really captured open-ended questions is so important to listen to families during this incredibly trying time. So thank you for that. In a minute, I'm going to open it up to questions. So really would invite the audience to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we'll actually ask my fellow commissioners first before opening more broadly, but I did want to just kick us off with a few questions of my own. And one was, of course, really appreciate the way the data is laid out, with showing us the disparities by race, which we know, but you noted there was a slide that showed that in recent months, maybe some of the material hardship, you showed that great dip for Black families and said that you're paying attention and we'll be looking into it. Noted though that for Latino families, there wasn't that same dip, and curious about, what you think the data is telling us there, and then generally interested in any commentary you have about the Spanish-speaking recipients of the data and anything that you see there.
Yeah, so I want to qualify what I'm going to say in terms of our tentative interpretation, that we don't right now have analyses that we've completed to support this possible explanation. We have some sort of indirect ways of getting at it, but at least one possibility is that among Latinx households that we have been following, that there are fewer who are eligible for stimulus relief because of being undocumented, or not having filed tax returns, and therefore that they're not benefiting from the kinds of stimulus relief that other low income or lower income households are experiencing, because they're just not able to get to access those funds. So that is a possibility. We have been very clear, especially until the most recent national election, that we did not want to ask anything about documentation from our participants for obvious reasons. But we do have questions about whether people expected to and or did or didn't receive stimulus payments. And so we're following up. This is actually just sort of a hot off the press analysis that we completed a couple of days ago. And so it's an interesting question to us as well. But that's sort of a plausible explanation, is just less access to federal stimulus relief funds for the reasons that I mentioned. We'll follow up with that. The other question is whether the trends continue or whether it's just a momentary change. And I think some of that will depend on, at least what we've seen in our prior data, whether funding continues to flow. So like the period where things seemed to be held at bay for the overall sample in terms of material hardship, the most was during that initial period of time when pandemic unemployment was still flowing regularly to people, $600 a week. And once that went away, it was when we really saw things begin to go much higher in terms of rates of material hardship. So I hope that was a helpful answer, but I'm also interested in whether there are other thoughts, because we're still also sort of questioning why that might be the case, those different trends.
Yeah, thank you. I think that does dovetail with my assumption was and what we've been seeing locally on the ground and here in California. I mean, just the other day, there was an article in the Sacramento Bee about the low rates of take up among Latino communities and families for the rental relief program. And that, I think outreach is really necessary to let folks know that they are eligible when they are eligible. And then, of course, the bigger problem is the ineligibility of some of these programs for mixed status families and undocumented families. So thank you.
We've heard very similar in our provider survey. One of our National Advisory Board members is in Arizona and has told us some just horrible stories about not only households, but also providers who are, living in cars and out on the street because they're not eligible for the programs that the federal government has put in place. So I do think that's going to be an ongoing issue of great concern.
One more question, and then I'll pass it on to my fellow. I see Commissioner Magaña has his hand up. But in addition to disparities by race and class, I'm curious what you observed in regards to gender and gender equity, if anything. Again, we've heard a lot about how this pandemic has taken a disproportionate toll on women, certainly in the workforce, and this whole term and concept of she-cession, and just wondering if you can comment at all about gender coming up in the data.
We can. We're starting to generate fact sheets for the 2021 data. We just put one out yesterday on how stimulus payments in 2020 were used by households. That's a separate question from what you're asking about. But in preparation for Mother's Day upcoming, we're going to put out a fact sheet about the way that women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And what we have found is that, first of all, as many as half of women in our sample have, so 1 in 2, has either left work or had a reduction in their work responsibilities during the pandemic. We don't know how that compares to men because we just don't, most of our respondents are women. And so we don't have a comparable male sample. And we haven't asked the respondents consistently enough to have a sense of, we could ask them, well, is your partner, what has they done? But those are very high rates. Those who have had those changes, first of all, there's a difference between those that are employer initiated versus those that are not employer initiated. So did you get laid off or fired, or did you get hours reduced is one thing. Did you have to reduce your hours or have to quit because of your responsibilities is another. But regardless of the source of the change, we find that when these changes have occurred, that again, the majority of people say that they can't afford the changes. So it's not people saying, oh, this is great, I don't have to, my kid's not in school, I guess I'll just cut back on my work. It's really, these are circumstances that are not desired. And the other thing that I think is most noteworthy from a gender equity perspective is that among those who have experienced job changes, those who've had it employer initiated have had the highest levels of emotional distress. Those who've had to do it on their own, that is not employer initiated, have had somewhat lower levels of emotional distress. And interestingly, and I think this really runs counter to some of the dominant cultural narratives, women who have had unchanged circumstances, that is, they continued to work and had childcare responsibilities, have the lowest levels of emotional distress. So turns out that balancing work and kids is not nearly as stressful as having less work or no work at all and dealing with the impact of that. And I think that's an important message because it runs counter to the idea that if women just stayed home, they'd be less stressed out and everything would be hunky-dory.
Interesting. Thank you. Commissioner Magana, and then I'll go to Commissioner Bagos-Cobiera-Layan.
Thank you, Commissioner Moreno. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for that presentation. I really appreciated kind of the synopsis of information, and quite frankly, it validated what we've been seeing anecdotally in community in our work. It was nice to see, it was important to see it at that level. Obviously, what it highlights is kind of the pervasive impact of poverty, right, which existed well before the pandemic ever hit, and particularly for communities of color. So many of these experiences are nothing new, as we know, to communities of color, while they may be somewhat new to communities that are not of color. I'm curious if you have any perspective or any thought, right, kind of on the notion of protective factors which promote resiliency, and kind of, the ability to get through this, which many communities of color have had for decades, for years, through the necessity to adapt. And I'm wondering if you have any sense of how the pandemic has actually impacted those protective factors which promote resiliency, and perhaps dampen kind of the impact of chronic stress, that toxic stress, which you talked about. And again, if there's a difference between certain communities with regard to those protective factors.
It's a great question. Thank you, Commissioner Magana. Several comments about what we found in our data with respect to these issues. So first of all, when we started looking at levels of emotional distress at the outset of the pandemic, and this held true for a considerable amount of time, although ultimately things kind of moved more closely together. But Black and Latinx households initially reported a smaller change from pre-pandemic levels of distress than white households. And I'll leave it to the commissioners think about why that might be the case. I think there have been a lot of potential explanations about not necessarily, dealing with new hardships that are different from day-to-day hardships around health and well-being and safety and things like that. But so that, I think that's just one finding. And it, you could think of it as resilience. It's resilience. If it is resilience, it's resilience in the context of structural racism, but nevertheless. The other thing that I think is really noteworthy in our data is that when we looked at perhaps the most well understood general resiliency factor, and I say that meaning applying to the sort of larger population without respect to specific subgroups, emotional support consistently came out as the thing that made the biggest difference in people's lives. But the thing that was really interesting, I think, was that we found that people were saying that their emotional support networks had shifted. So pre-pandemic, they said that they largely relied on coworkers and extended family members, people not living in the home, for emotional support. And they much less frequently endorsed those, especially coworkers, understandably, since so many people were not in the office or in workplaces, and much more relied on neighbors and on their own children. And their own children was a particularly interesting finding to us. We initially thought, well, that must mean that parents are relying on their older children, teenagers or pre-teenagers, to manage household responsibilities or take on some of the burden. Well, I'm sorry to say, if you have teenagers or pre-teenagers, you probably know that that's not always not always something you can expect from them. What we found actually was that it was young children, that people were saying that they found their interactions with their young children to be providing a kind of nurturing and support for them that was important. And I think that's a really meaningful finding, in the sense that in the context of our crazy busy lives pre-pandemic, people were coming and going so much that they didn't have the same kind of closeness that they were feeling with their young children as when we were all under the same roof. And so it created challenges and stresses that we should be paying attention to, but it also created some opportunities, I think, for people to experience some connection in ways that are really important and that we shouldn't forget. Those are the primary findings. And I think some of the things that you alluded to in terms of differences based on race and ethnicity that we might want to continue to look at in terms of other resiliency factors, we should continue to follow up on in the survey.
Thank you. As a parent of a tween and teen, I can to that.
We were hopeful for about an hour, and then we analyzed the data, and it went.
Forcing them to cuddle with me during this time.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah. Before we move on, I'm gonna ask for the next question, but there's just a few questions coming in through the Q&A about methodology, and I wanted to just get those clarified sooner rather than later. So there's a few questions about, did you survey the same families over time, or was this a different crop of families each time? Similarly, the breakdown between male and female respondents, I think you noted that it was a majority female response pool, but if you could let us know kind of what the breakdown was. And then the last question regarding methodology is, any issues recruiting people of color to take the survey? And if so, how did you address those?
Yeah, those are all great questions. So 90% female, and that's, we just asked for anybody in the household to take the survey, but we've just had a much higher rate of female respondents. And as I said, that has made it difficult to consider how men versus women, especially if we do any other additional segmentation by income or race ethnicity. In terms of the question of the design, it's really a mixed hybrid design that includes longitudinal and cross-sectional data. So when we started, this is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We knew that if we just tried to recruit one cohort of people that was going to continue to respond to surveys indefinitely, that we would lose people, and that we'd be struggling. So instead, we offer people the opportunity to participate in the survey repeatedly, but we don't require it for people to be able to participate. And we've developed, this relates to the last question as well about representativeness. We've developed I think, a pretty unique sampling process where what we do is to recruit people to take an initial survey that puts them into a larger pool for the ongoing survey. And so we get demographic information, we get some basic information about well-being, material hardship, and pre-pandemic information from that initial survey. And then we enter them into this larger pool. And every time we put out a subsequent survey, we then invite a portion of the larger pool to take the next survey. And because we are pretty clear at this point on the proportion of respondents that we invite, we can be very close to what we want in terms of representative numbers, because we invite X number of Latinx households that are, and then we can get the representativeness and X number of Black households, and similarly in terms of income and things like that. So we're able to do this sort of stratified recruitment process, and that makes a big difference for us in terms of maintaining representativeness. Did I get all those questions?
Yes.
I think those were the main three.
Yes, thank you very
Great.
much.
Yep.
Commissioner Basoko Villarreal, I'm going to hand it to you for your question.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Moreno. So, similar to the other commissioners, thank you so much for your time. This has been an intriguing presentation. I actually have two questions. One, I was fascinated, comment and two questions. I was fascinated that you had 120,000 responses so far. That's an incredible response amount. But I did note that when you were breaking down race and ethnicity, you only showed white, African American, and Latinx. And I was curious as to where, whether other races or ethnicities responded to your surveys, and whether or not there is any future interest in offering the questionnaire in other languages. I noted you only did it in English and Spanish, but here in the Bay Area, we have about 33% immigrant population, a huge Asian population. And so, just always curious, just from a local level, to know what's going on with our immigrant population. So one, and then two, under, it was your number 3 where you have a slide under healthcare interrupted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's an overall graph of who noted delayed healthcare for self or family member. Do you have it disaggregated into race and ethnicity to see, is it more Latinx that are delayed, or is it more African American? What kind of data do you have available?
Yeah, so these are all great questions. We could easily spend an hour on any one question that any of you commissioners have asked. So I'm really pleased with kind of the interest and just with what you're asking about, because they're the things we think about. So the question about other groups other than Black and Latinx is a really important one. We have, we got the survey launched relatively quickly, in about a month after we decided we would try to do it. We got some funding to do it. And the capacity that we have had up to this point has really limited what we can do in terms of both larger numbers and also in terms of getting more diversity into the national sample. It's still something that we aspire to and have been working on getting funding for the national survey, especially being able to have the survey be not just in English and Spanish, but available in other languages seems really critical. But I will also say, in some of our discussions with the first 5 staff in Alameda County, that one of the things that we're really certain about is that if there are local surveys that end up being done that are rapid but local surveys, that they're going to have those kind of capacity, that they're going to have to represent the local population. And we think that there's good potential to do that. If you can think about, if you could recruit 600 families from Alameda County to take the survey, it would have to be more linguistically diverse, and the sample would have to be more diverse, but you'd also then be getting numbers that allowed for segmentation of the county level data into groups that were analyzable in terms of the size of the sample. So it's very much our goal and aspiration, especially for the local surveys, to be able to do that. And we're really excited about that possibility. And I can give you the name of some of our funders. You could elbow them about having more funds for that in the national survey, because it's really important. In terms of healthcare utilization, the basic story, and I can give you more details in follow-up if you'd like, but the basic story is that we see the kind of the highest level of not accessing healthcare, not accessing COVID vaccinations and so forth among Black households. And when we ask about why, it has to do with historical experiences, lack of trust with the healthcare system, and barriers to access. The next in order and fairly close is Latinx households. The reasons there seem to be more structural barriers, being able to get away from work, to take your kid to the doctor, having other family members that you're taking care of that make it difficult to go. And then white households have had sort of the least impact in terms of health care interruption. There's also clearly an income gradient where we see much more lower income households having difficulties with access, less trust of vaccination, all kinds of things like that.
I'd like to thank my fellow commissioner for that question. It really dovetails with what I'm seeing come through in the Q&A. There's a lot of interest in understanding, beyond just Black and Latino families, the impacts on other subpopulations, in particular, the Asian American community.
Yep.
So
We shared the same.
So, I'm just curious, though. I hear you that, part of it is funding and drilling down to more localized survey. But just to be clear, was there anything in the data that you observed specific to Asian American communities that you could share?
It's when we've analyzed that data, first of all, our numbers are smaller, and so it's harder to draw conclusions. And second, the diversity in terms of income. And in terms of cultural diversity in the Asian households that have participated, make it very difficult to. There's much more variation in the Asian households, and since there's fewer and they tend to be more varied in terms of income and in terms of geographic distribution, it's a lot harder to say this is as a group how what we can say, and I think it speaks to even more. Again, more granularity needed in the context of that work. And again, I think immigrant households, in terms of American Indian, Alaska Native households, like there are many other groups where what we really have been aspiring to do is oversample so that we get more participation of those groups so that we can draw those conclusions. But I think the story of the survey to date is that any kind of disparities in health and income and in well-being and all of the things that are social determinants of health and well-being have played out in the context of the pandemic. So if there's risk, the risk is higher. If there were issues with equity, then the issues with equity have grown. And I think there are some differences that are somewhat group dependent, but the story is a fairly consistent story. Households with special needs kids, single parent households. You look at any subgroup in our data where we know that those kinds of disparities and where people are more exposed to social determinants of adverse health, and we see those families having more difficulties.
Yeah, exacerbated being one of the words of our experience of this pandemic.
Exactly.
Indeed. I see that our fearless leader, Kristen, has her hand up. So Kristen, I'm going to pass it to you for a question. You're on mute, Kristen.
There you go. See, I got to figure out how to turn on the mic. Thank you, Commissioner Moreno. Dr. Fisher, this is really it's not specific to your research, but it's a complement to it because your findings really lift up the socioeconomic underpinnings and how that creates stress. And then it impacts child development. And I'm wondering if your team or you are participating or how you're tracking both the impacts of the child tax credit as well as universal basic income initiatives, and just wondering your thoughts. And we've got recently in Oakland launched universal basic income, and there's one in San Francisco, and would love your take. And then I have another question after you answer that.
These are really important, and because our survey is ongoing, we're not only going to be able to understand how these kinds of initiatives, and especially if we have access to and are able to partner with local efforts where these things are being done more substantively. So CTC, great, it's going to impact lots of families. You know, there's a dose response in terms of, depending on where you live, the amount of money is going to go so far. So if you live in the Bay Area, it's going to go a lot less far than if you live in, you know, Central Valley, California. And I think that's really going to be important to be able to track that. And so we'll have data about that forthcoming. But the other thing that I want to say about these initiatives is that one of my concerns as a researcher is that I think we often think that policy is a blunt instrument, and therefore we have to do one size fits all solutions. But our work suggests, and this is pre-pandemic work, that financial stability and sort of you know, people not being in dire circumstances in terms of basic needs is just gets everybody to the same starting point. And for some people, it's sufficient. They can take it from there and do just fine. For other people, it's not going to be sufficient. And especially for people who've experienced considerable challenges, health challenges, you know, lost their large portion of children that have lost a parent during the pandemic, things that money will not solve everything. And I think when we think about this as, okay, now we've made sure that, you know, we've gotten 50% of kids out of poverty, we should be good. We need to continue to think, and I think that's really the idea of where we're hoping that there will be more systems change, so that the healthcare system is talking to the early childhood education system, and that therefore kids with special needs are getting their needs met, and that home visitors are integrated into not only home visitation, but home-based childcare visitation to provide support to providers. So there are all these pieces where things, I think, can potentially intersect. And to me, it's about the kind of a much more flexible way of thinking about the starting point is income and material well-being. And then what are the other pieces that some families are going to need? And how can programs be developed that don't mean that everybody has to get everything, but when people do need more, that it's available. So that's really our take on it. And again, eager to see how these things play out across time. I think we're best poised to understand and continue to document needs. But I think we can also probably use this methodology to understand impacts as well.
Yeah, and actually it's nice because you dovetailed into my follow-up question, but also just to point out how incredibly low the federal poverty limits are. So even if we were raising above that, it's what we know, to your point, in the Bay Area, that's woefully insufficient, and it doesn't.
Some of the data I showed, the highest income group is 4 times the federal poverty level.
Yeah,
that's like $82,000.
Yeah.
If you're a family of 4? What does $82,000 get you in, you know, Oakland or Berkeley or San Francisco?
Yeah,
Not much.
Yeah, exactly. And just in terms of I appreciate that your data just kind of supports, to your point, the socioeconomics is the beginning. And it's one of those things, without it, you know, it's obviously challenging and devastating for families. But with it, it's not the sole answer. And your point around kind of the integration and the fabric that needs to be woven, I'm wondering if navigation came up in terms of the navigation support, given that public systems have been woefully underfunded. It's fragmented. The front door is usually hard to get into.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if that came up and within the context of the various settings that people receive service, and if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. Yes, health navigators and systems navigators, I think, are one critical piece of the, you know, an active ingredient that could make a really big difference. The other thing, and I'm again speaking more from the pre-pandemic work that has been going on in our shop for a long time around program development and effective program development. I think that the way services have been delivered historically, and especially what's been funded and what's been acceptable to fund in terms of evidence-based programs, are just woefully inadequate in terms of meeting families where they need. And I think this is particularly true as you go further out into poverty, and also when you look at Black communities and Latinx communities and other immigrant communities and other racial and ethnic groups. It's sort of like you have to, if you want the services that are available too frequently, you have to go to where they're delivered. You have to accept, X number of meetings with X person where they're going to lecture you about what you don't know. Meanwhile, communities, I think, have tremendous indigenous knowledge about what kinds of things do make a difference. There are many community-based programs that are really delivering the kinds of supports that people demand and want. And they haven't been adequately invited to the table in terms of what we embrace in terms of policy. And the biggest challenge in that equation is how we've defined what we mean by evidence. So I'm going totally outside of the survey stuff here, but this is my soapbox issue. Evidence is a tool for learning. Evidence is never proof, and evidence therefore needs to be an active process. So the question is not, does your program work or not? Because we all know that programs only work so well for any, certain subgroup of individuals, but rather, what can your program do to understand how it's working and how to make it more effective over time and to be able to reach more people? And what we should be funding and what we should be incentivizing is programs' ability to continue to engage in the continuous QI process, the quality improvement process, using evaluation as a tool for that. And I think once that balance begins to shift and that becomes a valid kind of effort to support. So, it's not just like, oh, evidence is irrelevant. It's that evidence isn't something that somebody gathered 20 years ago in a university and says their program works. Evidence is, we're learning about our program and we're going to make it better and better and reach more and more people over time. If you can incentivize that, you're going to totally transform the supply and demand equation. And I think you're also going to address a lot of the equity issues that have existed in terms of who gets funding, who keeps funding, and who's being served adequately. So that's sort of our big message in terms of what all this data can do to help transform the landscape. It should just be sort of get people to the place where now they're starting to look for how to meet the needs of providers and of households in new and exciting ways.
Yeah, and interestingly, as I hear you talk about, all of that, it dovetails with the latter part of Kristen's questioning about this move toward universal basic income, cash assistance, no strings attached investment in folks, and that being, definitely meeting people where they are. So it will be interesting to watch that and to kind of watch the impacts of that over time.
Exactly.
A few questions from fellow commissioners. Our other fearless leader, Chair Hirschfeld, has a question, and then I'll move to you, Commissioner Cedeno.
Thank you. This has been really informative, and I appreciate the conversation. And so I'll tell you one fun fact that I just found listening to Kristen talk about the 400% of poverty. 3 years ago in 2018, I went to a conference where they shared what was the amount of money that a family of 4 with one preschooler and one school-age child needed by county. It was $98,296 in 2018. Don't know what it is right now, but that was a lot even then. So it made me wonder in the survey, like, are you able to separate out the data by state? Which I don't know how much that helps in California, but it made me wonder if you were able to separate it out by states. And then I also wanted to know, you talked about the possibility of being able to do local surveys. And I just was curious as to how do you know what would make for a representative sample in a county like Alameda?
Yeah. So we're not only able to separate out by state, but we have information out to the level of zip code. So we could easily, and we can pull out, for instance, the participants who've taken the survey who are from Alameda County to date. The challenge is that they're totally not representative because we didn't recruit to be representative of the county. I think in terms of these more local surveys, like if you take Alameda County as an example, there are a variety of ways to go about it. We're not epidemiologists. And so from my perspective, probably the wrong way to go is to say, what is every single group in the county and how do we make sure that we have enough in terms of income and race and ethnicity and immigration status to be able to draw conclusions about each of those groups, but rather probably more, what are the major subgroups that are of most importance from a policy and programming and services perspective, and how can you make sure that you have a sufficient number when you're thinking about, so for instance, the income is a great example. I mean, it doesn't make sense to just say, oh, we'll just look at, we'll make sure that we have a lot of people that are in the 400% or below, poverty level, and then everybody else will consider to be just fine, because there's a large portion of people that are 500% that are probably still, just hanging in there. And especially if there is some income loss would then have a lot of difficulty. So this is really a co-design process when we do more local surveys to understand what are the needs, this is like the perfect group for this. How does the commission here think about what are the sectors of the population or segments of the population that would be critical to have enough of in order to think really about how services are being met? And maybe it's, East versus West County, or maybe it's, if you think about the Asian population in Alameda County, how many different linguistic subgroups and cultural subgroups are there that are critical to have enough of to be able to make decisions about? So I can't, sitting here in Eugene, Oregon, sort of determine what that is. It's not, I wouldn't look up your census data and say, oh, here's what you have to do. It's something that has to dovetail with the way locally that the service landscape and just the needs of households are seen in order to design that recruitment process.
Thank you, Commissioner Cedeno.
Hi, and thanks again, an incredibly informative and powerful presentation. I was curious to the extent that you have been able to glean any insights around not just income, but I think this question around jobs and differences between formal and informal. And I think also as we started to think internally about, again, we've been so focused on response, and really a lot of our response is about like, how do we pump resources into basic needs, right? Addressing that material hardship. But as we're starting to think about how we're going to work and develop a strategy to help our families kind of come out of that, there's a lot of questions that are starting to come up that we don't have a clear answer to in terms of workforce development, job training, economic justice issues. And so to the extent that there's any insights you've been able to glean from prior research or the current survey data, I was just curious what you might have to say about that.
The survey has not had a strong focus on the specific jobs or specific employment that people have had up to this point. It's interesting that you talk about sort of the shift in focus. I think we were also, especially through, let's say, January, the inauguration, so concerned and preoccupied with really making sure that we were bearing witness to what families were going through, because we just didn't have a sense that anybody at the federal level was in a position, even if they wanted to, that things were structured in a way that was making it really difficult. And I have to say, for at least from my team's perspective, it took us a little bit of time in January, February to begin to reorient, because we've been so emphasizing this is what's not happening and where things are really falling apart, that even in pointing out bright spots, we didn't want to take our eye off of that. we've started to really shift now to what did families need before the pandemic? What will they continue to need? And what will people in the lives of children who take care of children also need that they were struggling with before? You know, people have had to piecemeal together childcare, but they were doing that before. It's just been, you know, different kinds of structures. So we're very eager to understand as we move forward, sort of what are the things that are going to make the biggest difference. And one of the things that we're about to start doing, I've had some interesting conversations with the US Chamber of Commerce Foundation to begin to gather information from families about what they want employers to know. What do they want? What did they think that employers should know about what families need to be successful? You know, employers want to get their businesses restarted. If people, this has been true for a lot of people that work in my shop. You know, a lot of people have asked if they can have a hybrid situation or just work from home. Why not? Like, why wouldn't we be able to do that unless you know, we're collecting data from families and people need to be in the office to do that. But you know, so how much flexibility is there in jobs? And also, if people need to be in the workplace, then where is the childcare? How close is it? And is it a place that you feel good about leaving your child and can get to them for breastfeeding when it's a young child during work hours? So all of those things I think are tremendously important, and they've been historically neglected. And so that's where we're beginning to turn our lens as well. And again, in local surveys, like county surveys, I think there's a lot of potential to zero in on what are the various sources of work and employment, where, you know, what are the big employers and how to begin to give them this information and kind of say, here's the family megaphone talking to you right now about what your employees need. The other thing I can say right now, just from yesterday data that I heard, and I can't remember the source, is that one of the biggest challenges right now, and this is something that Measure C could potentially affect, is that there's a huge shortage of infant and toddler childcare providers at a national level right now. People are having a really difficult time. There's just no people going into that area of work, and a lot of people who stop doing that work. So we're going to have a large number. I mean, right now there are unfilled slots, but that's not going to continue to be the story as things move forward. Sorry, that was a long answer to your question.
No, that was an excellent point about infant and toddler care. And also, I would just say the other finding in your data that's relevant to the employer conversation is you noted that people need time, right? They need time.
Yes.
They need parental leave. They need paid family leave. They need time to grieve.
Yep.
And so I do think this is a important thing for employers and to realize as well, the way in which we support our workforce to take the time that they need, whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's just like the diaper bank issue. I mean, the idea that not having diapers is an economic hardship is just one piece of the puzzle. And as you know, as the organizations that you guys have partnered with know, it also amounts to, if you don't have diapers, you're more likely to have your child get sick. You're more likely to then miss work yourself. And so it impacts at multiple levels. And I think the same is true in terms of these issues with employer facing kinds of things. If people have to decide whether to go to work sick, go to work and leave their sick child at home, or stay home and lose income, you're creating these toxic stress conditions where people are having to make choices while their kids are stressed that are making them stressed, and that's just not good for anybody.
Right. Moving to a few questions from the audience, although I would encourage my fellow commissioners to continue raising your hand, and I'll call on you to ask additional questions. But a couple coming through from the audience. One is, as an expert in early childhood development and policy, was there anything in the data that surprised you regarding the effects of this pandemic? And if so, what and why?
We were very surprised by the proportion of households that were experiencing material hardship. I think the idea that as many still as 1 in 4 families with a young child can't make ends meet in this country, given what we know about how these stress effects can have long-term impacts, was surprising and concerning to us. So that was definitely one one major takeaway. It wasn't a surprise that structural inequalities based on race and ethnicity existed, but it was very clear how much wider the gaps got, and I think that was a bit surprising. There are two other things that I'll tell you that that I think were unexpected. One of which was once we thought about it, made sense, and the other what continues to be really interesting. So the first one is that the households with a special needs child are clearly among the most hard hit when in every category that we looked at. Social isolation, parent distress, child distress, material hardship, difficulty accessing healthcare. That group stands out above the rest, and it's especially a concern because it's not surprising in the sense that special needs kids typically have received services in person, whether it's in home or in their early childhood care setting. They were seeing people, and the families were as well. And the pandemic cut that off. And my wife is this early childhood special ed consultant, so I've lived this. Doing Zoom calls with a kid or a family with special needs does not cut the mustard. It's just not a good medium. Even if you have good quality internet access, it still just doesn't work. So I think it was in many ways not surprising once we started to think about it, but it's certainly something, especially given how much we know early intervention as critical to promoting positive trajectories for kids with special needs, something that I think we'll need to continue to follow. And then the surprise was that there was a ton of media coverage at the beginning of the pandemic about pods. Everybody was going to send their kids to pods instead of school or childcare. It was the new thing, and is school really going to be a thing anymore? So we asked our respondents what proportion of them have used pods. I do a poll right now, but I think we don't have time, but it was 3%. So like there were, the New York Times covered it and NBC News had stories, look at these pods. And if you looked at a little bit more closely, it was white affluent families who could hire, an out of work teacher to come take care of their kids and take them to the playground. That was what pods represented. And what we heard from households was, it's me, it's my spouse, we're doing the online learning, we're doing the childcare, we're doing the work from home, or we're doing essential work stuff and having somebody else watch them, or it's somebody in the extended family who lives with us, who's dealing with the children. That was the story. It was not all these nifty, great ideas were like the worried well were taking advantage of them as they were, I'm sorry, you're probably getting my bent here, but as they were fleeing their cities, those were the pod users, and there weren't a lot of them.
Yeah, very interesting. Another question, could you say more about parental buffering and what that is?
I'm really glad that question got asked, because we've studied this a lot, and there's a lot of research on this. So when any person is stressed, there is a physiological response to stress. And stress is it can be physical stress, you're tired, you're sick, or it can be emotional or psychological stress. It doesn't matter what the sources of stress are because the body doesn't differentiate, it just responds. And it responds by activating a whole bunch of different biological systems. So, if you're in a near miss car accident, one of the responses is adrenaline. You get your heart pumping and, all that stuff. People have probably heard of cortisol. Cortisol is like a slow acting, similar kind of endocrine hormone. It helps to mobilize your immune system. It helps to metabolize stored energy in the body. It basically helps you get ready to defend against what you've been through. Your heart rate also increases initially. All kinds of other things happen when you're under stress. Those systems are also designed after they take action to shut themselves back down, because what they're doing is bring your body that's out of balance because of the stress back into balance. And so ultimately they come online and then they go offline. And that is a process that develops as we get older and as our bodies physiologically mature. Babies, they don't have the ability, those systems, when they get upset, when babies are tired or they need their diapers changed, or they're hungry, that same stress physiology comes online. But those systems, and it's because we're, so advanced evolutionarily, those systems actually require an adult, because we have the ability to have adults take care of our kids in our species. And so adults actually act as the sources, the external sources, to turn those systems off and get them back offline after they're activated. And that's why adults are seen as this buffer from stress, because they're the ones who, by nurturing, by comforting, by making skin to skin contact and saying soothing things, all of those things are the things that externally help turn the system off. And in the context of sort of ordinary circumstances, it doesn't have to be mom, it doesn't have to be dad, it doesn't have to be a biological relative, but somebody with whom the child has a meaningful relationship develops a dance with the child, what we call serve and return, where the child can put out signals and ultimately knows and can begin to rely on the fact that an adult will be there. Over time, as kids mature, they, especially under the kind of good serve and return circumstances, those systems develop enough on their own that then they do what works with adults, which is they shut themselves down and they return to balance. When we talk about toxic stress is that those systems come online and they need some kind of external input to go back offline, but that external input isn't being provided. And so they remain on high alert in an indefinite kind of way. And it's when those things happen in a protracted period that we begin to see that the connections made in the brain between different nerve cells are weaker, that the activation of really key areas of brain and biology gets affected. In kids who get a lot of early neglect, the systems actually kind of downregulate and shut down. So that's, and buffering is so important because it really is the external source of regulation. And as kids mature, it helps with those maturational processes. I want to be really clear, because this is especially for everybody in the audience. I'm not talking about, if you have a couple of bad days, that's not going to produce toxic stress. If you're going through a rough patch, it's not necessarily going to produce toxic stress. These are things where they're chronic conditions that go on for months and months. And where adults, it doesn't mean that the adult doesn't care or that the adult is maltreating the child, but just that their ability to focus in that kind of serve and return way gets taken away by the circumstances, by prior events in their lives, in some cases by things like addiction or mental health difficulties. Any number of things can do it. But that's why we've been so concerned about this, because the pandemic has imposed these circumstances. It's imposed them disproportionately based on race and income and other demographics. And so we want to make sure that the supports are there to ensure that any kinds of challenges that have occurred get addressed. The last thing I want to say is that a lot of our work has been on brain plasticity, and we know that to the extent that supportive kind of care can come in even after these kinds of conditions have existed, that a lot of these biological and brain systems can get back on track and make up ground that they've lost, but only in the context of the environment being supportive. So that's why we need to support families, we need to support childcare, we need to support schools to make sure that during this period of time, these things now, or the kids are having the kind of the most supportive kinds of environments where there is serve and return happening, is really what we want to see happening in this next period here.
Indeed, I think that's a really good note to end on, to just stress the resilience and adaptability of children and families, and the support that all of us are going to need, especially low-income children and families. So thank you so much. With that, I wanted to pass it back to Kristen to offer some closing comments and close us out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Commissioner Moreno, for hosting and moderating this session. I really appreciate it. And on behalf of the First Five team, Dr. Fisher, thank you so much both for joining us this morning, engaging in this conversation, but also just appreciation for your work and leadership at these, in these national conversations, and providing the data to be able to kind of dig in, inform policy and investment moving forward. And then to the broader commission and to staff, The intention was to think about Zoom. How do we leverage Zoom? How do we bring in national experts that can help us reflect on the work that we're doing and inform future conversations? And so I really appreciate the questions in the Q&A. I appreciate the participation of community, and I appreciate the questions of the commissioners themselves. And I also just want to reflect in terms of, it's nice to see both in the conversations that we've had with national leaders